These notes cover Week 7, Part 2 on macros. This is Module 7, Session 3, Automating Tasks with Macros. Macros are an automated instruction set. There are security issues and concerns with macros, and these will be covered in Session 3. Session 3, Creating and Using Macros. Here are the objectives. Learn about macro viruses and the Excel security features. Add the Developer tab to the ribbon to enable macros. Create and run a macro. A section on the Visual Basic Editor, which is optional for our purposes. Assigning a macro to a keyboard shortcut and a button. A button is a preferred way. And save and open a workbook in macro-enabled format. Here's the visual overview for working with macros. Macros are used to automate tasks that are performed repeatedly. Some examples include importing data from another file and/or printing worksheets. You will create a macro to save the receipt as a PDF file. Macros will help you be more productive as they will perform repetitive tasks consistently and faster than you can. Once the macro is created and tested, you are assured that the tasks are done exactly the same way each time. To create and run macros, you need to use the Developer tab. You will add it to the ribbon in this module. Here is a picture showing the Developer tab options. One is for code, and you will use the Record Macro button from this group. One is for add-ins. One is for controls. On the controls, we'll be able to run the macro, and you could also view the code behind if you choose to. One is for XML. We will not be covering anything from the XML controls, but if you want to take a look at the source, you absolutely are welcome to do so. And the final one that has been cut off is to modify document controls. It's important that you understand that macros can be a security risk. Macro viruses spread when a user opens or closes an infected document. They run on applications, not on operating systems. Therefore, they can spread easily across different computer platforms and networks. You can and should follow the link to the Norton webpage that is posted on the timeline to read about them in more detail. The macro viruses use the program's own macro programming language to distribute the virus. Frequently, Outlook has been hit with macro viruses. They can be destructive, and they can modify or delete files that may not be recoverable. Protecting against macro viruses. The macro security settings control what Excel will do about macros in a workbook when you open that workbook. You can set macro security in the Trust Center. The Trust Center is a central location for all of the security settings in Office. By default, all potentially dangerous content is blocked without warning. If content is blocked, the message bar, also called the Trust bar, opens below the ribbon, notifying you that some content was disabled. You can click the message bar to enable content. There are two options for creating a macro. We will focus on the first, using the macro recorder. The macro recorder is a good choice for creating simple macros. It can record the actions that you perform with the keyboard and/or the mouse. For more sophisticated macros, you may need to write VBA code directly into the Visual Basic Editor. This section on working with the VB Editor on pages 440 through 444 is optional for this lab. For those of you interested in the code behind the macro instructions, You can and should review it, but it is not required for Module 7. Here is a picture of the Record Macro dialog box. We see that you want to enter a descriptive name. You can have an optional keyboard shortcut, and you can select the location to store the macro. By default, the macro is stored in the current workbook, and then it is only available with this workbook. Another option is to store the macro in the Personal Macro Workbook. This is a hidden workbook named personal.xlsb that opens whenever you start Excel. You can store commonly used macros here. Otherwise, you can store the macro in a new workbook. Running a macro. To run the macro you created, you can either use the shortcut key you specified or select the macro in the macro dialog box, as we see here. After you record a macro, you should run it to test whether it works correctly. This is important. Running a macro means Excel performs each of the steps in the same order as when it was recorded. The macro dialog box lists all of the macros in the open workbooks. From this dialog box, you could select and run a macro, edit the macro with VBA, that would show the code behind, run the macro one step at a time so you can determine which step an error occurred, or you can delete the macro. If you find you have a problem, probably the best way to fix it is to re-record the macro. But you can isolate the problem by running the macro one step at a time, using the VBE editor and watching it run in step by step. You can also delete a recorded macro and then re-record. Working with the Visual Basic Editor is the optional section, listed pages 440 through 444. For those of you interested in the code behind, this is an interesting section and you're welcome to do it, but it's not required for this module. One way to run a macro is to assign it to a button. Macro buttons are often better than using shortcut keys because you can add a descriptive label, and then it is more intuitive and simpler for the user than trying to remember different combinations of keystrokes. This slide shows the Developer ribbon tab selected, and in the Control group, you would select Insert, and the first option there is the button to create a button option on the worksheet to run the macro. When you save a workbook that contains a macro, a dialog box opens indicating that the workbook you are trying to save contains features that cannot be saved in a macro-free workbook. The default Excel workbook does not allow macros to be stored as part of the file. And so, if you want to save a macro-enabled workbook, you need to give it a new name, and it will have the XLSM file extension. Saving a workbook with macros continued. In the macro warning dialog box, click Yes, and you will not be saving the workbook with the macro. It will be lost. Click No button if you want to save the workbook with the macro, and then save the workbook as a new file, one that will allow the macro to be saved as part of your file. When you open a file, Excel checks the opening workbook to see if it contains any macros. When and if the workbook opens the first time, a security warning appears in the message bar with an option to enable or disable macros. You should always be wary of workbooks that you're not familiar with that has this security warning. This is the end of Mod 7 Part 2 on macros. If you have any questions or issues, please post to the forum. And I strongly encourage you to follow that link and read the information about macroviruses.